Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Dr. Jonathan Schanzer, Executive Director at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Dr. Schanzer, thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure.
We have seen some new developments in the war between Israel and Hamas starting early Tuesday morning. Israel launched massive airstrikes across Gaza 2 months after the first phase of the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas went into effect. To start off the conversation, can you explain why we're seeing this military action in Gaza right now?
Sure. Well, as we all know, there was a ceasefire that took effect. It was supposed to be a 3-phase ceasefire. The first phase went reasonably well. There were problems along the way. Hamas was slow in providing the list of those that it was going to release, and in some cases there were delays. Certainly there were tactics of psychological warfare being used. In one case, they had soldiers that were being held for the second phase. They were forced to watch the release of other hostages. The family saw their children, their loved ones watching this. The Israelis did not like that very much. But I think the big question really began to loom as we ended first phase, because second phase was supposed to basically entail the release of the remaining live hostages and for Israel to leave Gaza permanently. In other words, to end the war. But all the while, the Israelis were watching Hamas continue to try to organize militarily. They continued to hold the Gaza population hostage. There was just a general sense that this was not something that was sustainable from an Israeli security perspective. There are some in Israel who point out that if this Israeli government had agreed to a permanent end of the war, we would have likely seen the collapse of the current right-leaning government. That's probably true. But I do believe that at the end of the day, the Israeli public largely is on the side of Benjamin Netanyahu, who wants to destroy Hamas once and for all, to make sure that this threat no longer exists on Israel's southern border. And so that's why I think we're watching this take place right now. And the Israelis have been striking at key targets across the Gaza Strip.
I'm curious what you think the responses from Hamas is going to be, because the Hamas-run health ministry said that over 400 people were killed in these airstrikes. How do you think they're going to respond?
Well, I mean, first, let's just acknowledge that the Gaza Health Ministry is, of course, Hamas, right? Their job is propaganda. They've been using this so-called health ministry from day one of this conflict to overinflate the number of casualties reported. Amazingly, we've been watching many in the American press essentially regurgitate these numbers without even trying to do any fact checking. And it's hugely problematic because I suspect the numbers are lower. And there's also the question of how many militants versus civilians have been killed. I'm going to guess here that the number of militants is rather high and the number of civilians is rather low. The real question, though, is what kind of capabilities Hamas has. And here I think we just should not expect there to be a lot. They don't have a lot of rockets left. And the more that Israel targets that underground infrastructure, those tunnels, I think the less Hamas will be able to bring rockets out from underground in order to fire them. The Israelis have taken out a number of the remaining leaders of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. They haven't taken out Mohammed Sinwar, the brother of Yahya Sinwar, who was the mastermind. He's the guy that's running the war in Gaza right now. But they were able to take out, I think, another dozen or so senior leaders, or at least whatever's left of the senior leadership. I don't expect there to be a significant backlash. But what I would say is this, that the Israelis are attacking Hamas at the same time that the United States is striking at the Houthis in Yemen. You get a sense right now that together, Israel and the United States are weakening the Iranian axis, this proxy of six, or this network of 6 proxies. The broader strength of Iran is flagging. And moreover, the president of the United States warned the Iranians that if they start to, if they direct the Houthis to attack Israel or the United States, that Iran will be held to account. So you get a sense maybe that the entire Iranian proxy network may be being picked apart right now, right before our eyes, and that Iran, with any luck, will be deterred.
To your point about the United States and Israel in tandem right now, the United States attacking the Houthis, Israel launching their airstrikes, there is reporting that Israel told the United States that these airstrikes were going to happen beforehand. National Security Council spokesperson Brian Hughes reportedly said this, quote, Hamas could have released hostages to extend the ceasefire, but instead chose refusal and war. Hamas wants the negotiators of the ceasefire deal to hold both Israel and Netanyahu, quote, fully responsible for violating and overturning the ceasefire. So as of now, what do these airstrikes do to the ceasefire talks?
Well, I think that when the airstrikes began, it was widely described as phase 1.5 in these ceasefire talks. In other words, what the Israelis had floated to Stephen Witkoff, the envoy for the Trump administration for these negotiations, they said, look, we can't agree to end the war. Hamas continues to engage in a military buildup. We continue to watch maneuvers in the Gaza Strip. There's no way we're going to let these guys continue to operate there or to continue to exist for that matter. But here's something that they were willing to float. They told Witkoff, well, look, how about we keep a ceasefire through the month of Ramadan, which we're in right now. There's about 2.5 weeks left. And have it extend all the way through the end of Passover, which would take us roughly into mid-April. This was the agreement that the Israelis put on the table. Hamas refused to do anything of the sort. The Qataris, the primary mediators, joined Hamas in rejecting this. I think the Egyptians did it as well, if I'm not mistaken. And so there was an opportunity to extend this thing without going into the phase 2 that Israel wouldn't be able to accept. And quite frankly, it didn't seem that the United States was particularly interested in pushing the Israelis, knowing what the fallout might be. So there was this other opportunity. Hamas rejected it. I think it's still on the table, as far as I understand. I mean, these airstrikes, it's not like Israel has put thousands of boots on the ground. So there isn't like a large ground maneuver that Israel would have to call back. These are airstrikes that are taking place by various aircraft against military targets. That can stop, I think, as the moment that Hamas says, yes, we're willing to release another 5 or 10 hostages in exchange for several weeks of quiet. That would, I think, be the preference here for everyone, the United States, Israel, maybe just not Hamas or Iran.
I am curious. I'm thinking about the hostages right now. Does this jeopardize their safety at all? Because Hamas's senior political leader said that Netanyahu's decision to launch these airstrikes is essentially a death sentence for the living hostages in Gaza.
Well, I think that's the big fear. And we are seeing the hostage families in Israel decrying this move because they had hoped to get the remaining, we're hearing some dissonance here, somewhere between 19 and 21 live hostages and another couple of dozen bodies that are still being held by Hamas. It's those 19 or 21 that the Israeli public would love nothing more than to get back. But again, I think the question is, would Israel trade them coming home for ending the war? Will Israel allow Hamas to continue to exist and to continue to build up its military infrastructure in Gaza in exchange for getting these Israeli hostages released? That's not something that many Israelis are going to say yes to. Certainly the families of the hostages, certainly those on the Israeli left, they're saying, get the deal done, absolutely, no matter what it takes. These people have suffered enough, and they have suffered. There is no doubt about it. More than 500 days in Hamas captivity, subject to torture and starvation and living in tunnels. No one wishes that upon anyone. But I think right now we're looking at a strategic decision undertaken by the Netanyahu government that allowing Hamas to remain in Gaza, to grow stronger in Gaza, to rebuild in Gaza. That was something that I think the Israeli government was just simply unwilling to countenance.
What then does Hamas do? Because can Hamas survive this? Can Hamas survive what Netanyahu's office described as increasing military force? Will they surrender and say, hey, let's get to the negotiating table? I mean, what do their next moves look like?
Well, look, I think they're going to sustain some damage. There's no question. For me, the big question mark is how much damage are they willing to sustain? Are they willing to give up? I mean, I think waving the white flag is an option for Hamas. You got to remember, this is a terrorist organization that once controlled an area that's roughly the size of Washington, D.C., a population of about 2 million people. They've left it in total rubble. They have left the people in total despair. They have lost the support of the people by and large. There are still some that want to come out and support it, and we're seeing them. These are young men in tracksuits picking up AK-47s. But really, instead of that 30,000 or 35,000 man force that existed before the war began, right now we're looking at 5 to 10,000, most of them untrained, most of them not able to operate the heavy weapons, not able to fire the rockets. They can essentially operate with AK-47s in an urban warfare setting. This is not going to bode well for Hamas. I think for me, when I watch this endgame play out, I wonder about whether other Iranian proxies try to get back into the action. I see most of them as very weak. So Hamas is not going to find support from Hezbollah. They are largely wiped out. The Syrian Shiite militias, no longer operational because the Assad regime fell in Syria back in December. The Iraqi Shiite militias that had been firing, we don't see much from them right now, and they look somewhat deterred. The Houthis are now being engaged by the United States military, sustaining really just a massive bombardment campaign. Iran lost its air defenses back in November. They're not likely going to get back into the action because they're very vulnerable. So Hamas is fighting this alone. And the question is, are they willing to fight to the very end as a symbol of what they would call Palestinian resistance? That's one option for them, and it's a grim option for all of us to watch a war along those lines. The other is that they agree to do something along the lines of what the PLO did in Lebanon, where they agree to leave. They surrender and they go on to a third country and perhaps live to fight another day. I suspect that's what the Trump administration and maybe what the Israelis are going to be pushing for in Doha as these negotiations continue amidst live fire in Gaza.
And I know that there are a lot of questions that remain to be seen, as you said, but is there any indication, as the expert here, of what this very end looks like? Does it look like they wave the white flag, that they surrender? Does it look like they fight to the very end? What are your senses here?
Look, I think that the ideology of Hamas lends itself to fighting until the last man. And I say that with no glee. It is a grim prospect to consider a war that is fought to the finish in this way. Usually wars will end with one side waving the white flag. I think that is the logical option. It is the humane option for Hamas to embrace. If they continue fighting, it's only going to bring more misery and more destruction upon the Gaza Strip, and I don't think anybody wants to see that. But as long as Hamas continues to fight, Israel has very little choice but to fight in return. What they need to do is to release the hostages and to wave the white flag. That has always been the answer here. The war was never going to work out to Hamas's advantage, not unless somehow all of Iran's proxies got together and joined up to fight Israel. That, of course, didn't happen. So right now, Hamas is fighting alone. And I suspect this is going to be a grim and drawn out end to the war if Hamas does not surrender.
And once again, I'm thinking about these hostages right now in conversations with you and other experts. The hostages have always been top of mind for Israel. Is there a sense on the ground in Israel, is there a lot of support for Netanyahu for these airstrikes? Because when you're thinking about Hamas then saying this is essentially a death sentence for the hostages, what are people thinking right now? Are they supporting Netanyahu?
Look, Netanyahu is in a tough spot right now, actually, because he just a couple of days ago, he made a move to fire the head of his Shin Bet, the Internal Security Services, essentially Israel's equivalent of the FBI. And that was already lighting up the streets. The opposition to Netanyahu is getting heated. They're talking about putting people out in the streets in large numbers. And there are challenges already underway from a legal perspective against this move. This happens already as the hostage forum, the families of the hostages, those that have been returned, alive or dead, those that are still in Gaza, alive or dead, The families have banded together. They are a powerful political force on the Israeli left. They are also attacking Netanyahu. On the right, however, Netanyahu has significant support. And even, I have to say, amongst many in the center who want to see Hamas destroyed, who want to see Iran cut down, who want to see all these other Iranian proxies cut down. This is where I think Bibi has that core support that he has long enjoyed. I'd say that Israel is probably split 50-50, 60-40. Really hard to know exactly where the public is at this exact moment. I think we'll be getting some polling numbers coming out in the very near future. Now that the war has started back up, we'll get a sense of what public opinion has to say about these maneuvers. But I think Netanyahu is likely safe with this pursuit of the war, the resumption of the war, because Hamas did not release the hostages, because Hamas still poses a threat to Israel, and because all of the proxies are still out there, and Israel has a bit more fighting to do if it's to win.
I am curious, finally, I want the United States' perspective here. As we know, the first phase of the ceasefire was negotiated with the Biden administration as well as Trump's special envoy, Stephen Witkoff. 2 months later, I'm curious, the ceasefire was ended. Trump is in the White House. What is the Trump administration's influence right now on what's happening in the Middle East?
It's enormous. And I think you have to understand that right now, I mean, early on, Trump said Bibi can do whatever he wants. He gave a green light. And Bibi understood that he had the green light. I was at one point joking that he was a little bit like the dog that caught the mailman, right? I mean, he didn't quite know what to do. This decision that he could do whatever he wanted, it landed in his lap. And actually, you saw him freeze up for a bit. And he continued to allow these negotiations to play out, as we called it, phase 1.5, trying to get additional fighters, or rather additional hostages released in exchange for Hamas fighters, in exchange for another, 6 weeks of calm, give or take. And when that did not appear to play out, when it appeared that that had reached a dead end, this is when Bibi started striking Gaza again, started striking Hamas. But he did it after the American-led strikes on the Houthis. In other words, he joined in after Trump had already started this campaign against the Iran-backed terrorist organization in Yemen. It really does look like, at this point, coordinated activity. And I have to say, the psychological impact of that right now on Iran and its network of proxies is significant. For Iran to look on somewhat helplessly as the United States degrades the Houthis and as Israel degrades Hamas, there is powerful messaging right now that I am sure is not lost on the rest of the Arab world, and certainly not on the Iran terror network that has been active for the last year and a half. So I think the shadow of Trump looms large across the Middle East right now. And I think that the big shadow right now is cast over the Islamic Republic of Iran. They are watching right now. They know they're weak.
And finally, before I let you go, what specifically are you looking out for next?
Well, I want to see how degraded the Houthis become, because the big question is whether they start firing ballistic missiles at Israel as Israel ramps up their attacks against Hamas. So that's, I think, part of the equation. The other one is all eyes on Lebanon again. Hezbollah still exists. It's a lot weaker. Its leadership is in total disarray, and it's really unclear what kind of fighting force it can muster right now. But I would watch for that too, because they still have an arsenal of, let's say, 50 or 60,000 rockets and missiles that can be deployed. But the big thing that I'm watching for is whether the U.S. and Israel reach an agreement as it relates to the Iranian nuclear program. This is the existential threat in the region. The rest of this stuff is tactical or strategic, does not rise to the level of something that will keep the Trump administration up at night. But nukes developed by the Islamic Republic, that is a serious challenge. And there is major opportunity right now. I cannot overstate this, that the air defenses of Iran are down. They do not have the ability to repel an attack. If the U.S. and Israel decided to go into Iran to destroy those nuclear facilities, that is something that is very feasible right now. And as we watch things heat up, what Iran does could have very serious ramifications for the survival of the regime. So that's what I'm watching at this moment.
Dr. Schanzer, certainly a lot to look out for. Per usual, I always appreciate your expertise. You are welcome back anytime. Thanks for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you.